Welcome to Twisted Roots, a place where family stories are told not just to entertain, but to remind us of the bonds that shape us, for better or worse. If you've ever found yourself holding onto the lessons of a parent or questioning what family really means, then this is your home too. I'd love for you to subscribe so that these stories of love, loss, and legacy, find their way to your heart every week. Story title: I sacrificed my dreams for my family, but they left me alone in my final days. The room was quiet, too quiet for a man who had once carried the noise of an entire household on his back. Only the steady beep of the heart monitor broke the silence, marking time the way a clock counts down the final seconds of a game already lost. There he was, a father lying in a hospital bed, fragile as paper, chest rising and falling beneath the weight of years. The fluorescent lights washed the color from his skin, leaving behind only the faint memory of the strength he once carried. His eyes, half open, half searching, shifted again to the doorway as though expecting someone to arrive, but no one came. The hallway outside echoed with other families. Laughter, footsteps, voices calling Dad were here, but not for him. For him, there was only absence. He had given everything, every paycheck, every dream, every ounce of youth for the family he believed would one day return that love. He had missed chances, lost opportunities, buried his own desires, all in the name of providing. To him, sacrifice was not a choice, it was the language of love, and yet this was how they repaid him, by not being here, by letting the man who built their world fade away in silence. The nurse at the night shift stopped for a moment, watching him. There was a tenderness in her gaze. The way you look at something both beautiful and broken. She could feel it. That kind of loneliness doesn't happen overnight. It's carved slowly, year after year, by the very people we once believed would never leave us. His name was Daniel Whitaker, a father, a dreamer once, a man who had carried a family like Atlas carried the sky, and tonight he lay alone. Before he was the frail figure in a hospital bed, before the silence swallowed his final days, Daniel Whitaker was a boy with paint on his hands and sunlight in his eyes. In his youth, he carried a sketchbook everywhere, notebooks filled with charcoal smudges, half-finished portraits, landscapes drawn from memory. He wanted to see the world not through money or possessions, but through color. His dream was to become an artist, to stand before a canvas and turn empty space into meaning. He believed in those tender years that art could save people, that a painting might speak what words could not. But dreams are delicate things. They don't always survive the weight of real life. Daniel's father was a stern man who believed brushes and canvases belonged to idle hands. Art doesn't put food on the table, he would say. A real man earns his living. His mother, though gentler, whispered the same truth in softer tones. Bills had to be paid. His younger siblings needed shoes. The world didn't pause for the whims of color and paint. So at 18, Daniel put his sketchbook away. He traded easels for work boots and canvases for factory floors. What began as a temporary job to help out became a lifetime of labor. He told himself he would come back to it one day, that art would wait. But one day became 1 year. And 1 year became decades. The paintbrushes gathered dust, and so did his dreams. And yet every so often, when the house was quiet and the children were asleep, he would sit at the kitchen table with a stub of a pencil and an old envelope. He'd sketch his wife's smile, or the outline of his son's face, or the way the autumn trees bent in the wind. Quick, quiet strokes, always unfinished, always interrupted by life calling him back. He chose stability because he loved his family more than he loved himself. He believed that if he gave them security, if he gave them opportunity, that would be enough, that they would understand his sacrifice, that they would remember. But here is the tragedy. When you bury your dreams for too long, sometimes the people you bury them for never even notice the grave. And so Daniel carried on, shift after shift, year after year, the artist inside him growing smaller, quieter, until only a whisper remained, a whisper that would return to haunt him in the loneliness of his final days. Dreams may fade, but duty rarely does. For Daniel Whitaker, once he laid down his sketchbook, he picked up something far heavier, the burden of responsibility. He became the kind of man who woke before the sun did. His alarm was not a clock, but the sound of his own conscience telling him his family needed him. In the winter, he laced his boots in the dark, stepping out into air so cold it burned his lungs. In the summer, he carried his lunch in a dented tin box, wiping sweat from his brow before the first bell even rang at the construction site. Daniel worked wherever work was found, on scaffolds that swayed in the wind, in ditches carved deep into the earth, under roofs half-built where rain soaked through tarps and lightning split the sky. He hammered, hauled, lifted, carried, until his hands became rough as leather. When others quit at dusk, Daniel stayed until the foreman's whistle finally blew. Every paycheck went into building a life for his family. First, it was food on the table, warm meals so his children would never know hunger the way he once had. Then it was school books, pencils, and shoes that fit just right. Later, it became the down payment on a small house at the edge of town. The paint peeled, the floors creaked, but it was theirs, a place where birthdays were celebrated, where the smell of his wife's cooking lingered, and where his children could grow without fear of landlords or eviction notices. Neighbors saw only a quiet man with a tired smile. They never knew how many times Daniel skipped meals so his children could eat, or how often he patched the same work shirt again and again because buying a new one felt wasteful. They didn't see him counting bills at the kitchen table under dim light, calculating how to stretch dollars that were never enough, but his children saw. They saw their father bent over with exhaustion, coming home with his lunch pail half empty and his back aching. They saw him fall asleep in a chair, boots still on because there wasn't enough strength left to climb into bed, and Daniel believed that one day they would understand. That one day they would look back and realize this is what love looks like, because to him, love wasn't words or gifts or grand gestures. Love was calloused hands. Love was standing in the rain so his kids could walk in the sunshine. Love was a man giving away pieces of himself, one shift at a time, so that his family could live a little easier. And so he carried on day after day, year after year, building a foundation not from bricks or beams, but from sacrifice. Children dream easily. They dream without limits, without the weight of reality pressing on their shoulders. And Daniel, despite his exhaustion, never wanted to clip those wings. When his son Mark announced he wanted to study engineering at a university 3 states away, Daniel's heart swelled with pride. No Whitaker had ever gone that far before, not into higher education, not into halls where futures are decided, but pride was quickly chased by fear, tuition, rent. Books, the numbers stacked higher than any scaffolding Daniel had ever climbed, so he did what fathers do. He found more hours to work. He picked up night shifts when his body begged him to rest. He poured concrete by day and swept factory floors by night. He told himself, if my son can build bridges, I can build him the bridge to get there. His daughter, Emily, dreamed differently. She wanted to see the world, to work in medicine, to heal people the way her mother once longed to heal. I want to help others, Dad, she told him, her eyes shining. Daniel nodded, though inside he wondered how he would afford her textbooks, her scrubs, her endless training. Still, he found a way. He always did. He sold the small fishing boat he had saved for since his 20s. He let go of the watch his father had left him, the only heirloom he owned, just to pay a semester's fees. Each sacrifice cut deeper. But Daniel convinced himself the pain was worth it. His children's dreams would live, even if his own remained buried. There were nights when his wife, weary from her illness, would whisper, "Danny, you can't keep this up, you're giving too much." And he would simply smile, press her hand, and say, "It's never too much when it's for them." The house itself bore witness to his devotion. The wallpaper peeled, the roof needed mending. But inside were 2 children who never had to question whether they could chase their ambitions. Every creak in the floorboards, every nail he drove into the frame was a promise. You will have what I never had. He believed, truly believed, that one day when the children were grown and strong, they would see what he had done. They would remember the man who stood behind their dreams, and maybe, just maybe, they would carry him when his strength finally gave out. But dreams, like debts, have a way of accumulating, and while his children soared higher, Daniel's back bent lower under the weight of keeping them aloft. Dreams are heavy, but illness is heavier still. Just as his children's futures began to take shape, life placed another weight on Daniel's shoulders. His wife, Margaret, the girl he had courted with doodles on scrap paper, the woman who once laughed so freely at his quiet jokes, grew pale and tired. At first, he told himself it was nothing, just exhaustion, just the strain of raising a family. But then came the coughing, the fevers, the doctor's appointments that stretched into hospital visits. The diagnosis fell like a hammer: chronic illness, the kind that doesn't heal with medicine alone, the kind that steals energy day by day. From that moment, Daniel's life became a balancing act of impossible proportions. By day he carried lumber and bricks, clocking in long hours on job sites that tore at his body. By night he carried her, sometimes literally, helping her from the bed to the kitchen, or to the bathroom when her legs could no longer bear her weight. He learned to cook simple meals, though he had never been much of a cook. He learned the language of prescriptions, insurance forms, and hospital corridors. He sat in waiting rooms while machines hummed and doctors spoke in clipped, careful tones. And through it all, he told his wife the same thing he had always told his children: "Don't worry, I'll handle it." Neighbors noticed the change in him. He grew thinner, his once strong frame bending under invisible burdens, but Daniel rarely complained. Love to him was not about ease, it was about endurance, and he endured everything for her. At times, when the children were away at school, he would sit beside her bed and sketch her sleeping face on the back of a bill envelope. The lines were shakier now, the pencil dull, but he captured her the way he first saw her, gentle, full of grace. He never showed her these drawings. They were his secret way of holding onto the woman she had been, and the woman she still was, even as illness dimmed her light. Margaret would whisper to him on her better days, her voice a fragile thread, "Danny, you're carrying too much." And he would kiss her forehead and reply, "I'd carry the world if it meant you didn't have to." But even love has its limits. Each hospital bill stacked like bricks on his back. Each unpaid hour he spent caring for her was a wage lost, a debt gained. His children were soaring upward, chasing their dreams, while Daniel sank deeper into sacrifice, tethered to a promise he refused to break. He had once dreamed of painting beauty into the world. Instead, his masterpiece became this, a life poured out completely for others, brushstroke by brushstroke, until there was almost nothing left of himself. There comes a point when a man no longer lives for himself, but only for the people tethered to him. For Daniel Whitaker, that point stretched into decades. He gave up little things first: the weekend fishing trips with his old friends, the Sunday afternoons when he once sketched in the park, catching the light as it fell through the branches, the evenings when he might have sat on the porch and simply watched the sky change colors. Those were luxuries now. And luxuries had no place in a life built on sacrifice. Then he gave up bigger things, his health for one. The years of long shifts bent his back, wore down his knees, and carved permanent aches into his shoulders. The doctor warned him about his blood pressure, about the way his heart labored harder than it should. Daniel nodded, promised to take it easy, but then returned to work the very next morning. Responsibility didn't allow for rest. Friends drifted away too. At first they called, inviting him out for a drink, for a ball game, for a small escape. But each time he had to decline. There was always another shift, another bill, another doctor's visit for Margaret, another expense for Mark or Emily. Eventually the invitations stopped. His world shrank to a triangle: work, home, hospital. Even laughter faded from his life. His children's voices filled the house during visits and holidays, but Daniel himself rarely laughed. Not because he lacked humor, but because he carried so much weight inside him that laughter felt like a luxury he hadn't earned. And yet through all this he believed. He believed that love, when given so freely, must eventually be returned. That one day when his body finally gave out, his children would be there to carry him as he had carried them. He imagined it the way a tired worker imagines retirement, the day he could finally rest. Knowing his sacrifices had not been in vain, he thought of it often, sometimes in the dead of night when he sat alone at the kitchen table. His hands would rest on the grain of the wood, worn smooth over the years, and he would whisper into the empty room, "They'll remember, they'll see what I've done for them." He lived on that hope. It was the thread that held his weary body together, the quiet bargain he made with life. I will give them everything now, and in the end they will give me love. But bargains, like dreams, do not always hold. And as the years wore on, Daniel found himself growing older, lonelier, more fragile, yet still waiting for a return that never came. Success has a strange way of redrawing the lines of family. At first, it feels like victory for everyone, as though one person's triumph lifts the entire household. But over time, those triumphs can become walls, and Daniel Whitaker knew this more than anyone. Mark, his son, graduated with his engineering degree. Daniel remembered the day with pride swelling in his chest. He sat in the farthest row of the auditorium, his calloused hands folded neatly in his lap. Tears brimming as he watched Mark cross the stage, he thought his heart would burst with joy. All those years, he whispered to himself, worth it. But afterward, when families gathered in clusters for photos, Daniel stood off to the side, waiting. Mark posed with classmates, with professors, with friends and their families. By the time Mark finally waved him over, the photographer had already packed up his camera. "Sorry, Dad, next time," Mark said lightly, already looking past him toward a celebration dinner he hadn't been invited to. Emily, too, found her path. She became a nurse and later the wife of a respected surgeon. Daniel helped with the down payment on their first condo, handing over money he had saved for repairs on his own crumbling roof. "Just until we get settled, Dad," she promised. Years passed and the roof continued to leak. The promise never returned. At first, Daniel excused their distance. "They're busy," he told himself. "They're building lives. Isn't that what I worked for?" He waited by the phone each Sunday, expecting calls that grew less frequent. Holidays shrank into quick visits, hurried meals, polite hugs. His children's laughter now belonged to dining rooms he wasn't invited into, behind doors he no longer entered. And slowly he noticed something painful. The more successful they became, the less they seemed to see him. Not the man who had carried bricks and debts and sleepless nights, but a burden, an aging father with thinning hair, slow steps, and stories that no longer interested them. When he asked for small things, help fixing a broken stair, company for a doctor's appointment, there was always a reason why they couldn't. Mark had deadlines, Emily's children had school events. "Next week, Dad," they said. Next week rarely came. The silence in his house deepened. Once filled with the chaos of toys and arguments, the hum of a family growing, it now echoed only with the ticking of clocks and the creak of floorboards. Daniel found himself talking more to the photographs on the mantel than to his own children. He told himself not to be bitter. He reminded himself that distance was part of life, that children were supposed to move forward. But late at night, when he lay alone in bed, he felt it, not just distance, but abandonment. The kind of quiet that tells you you've given everything, and in return, you've been left behind. Daniel had once believed sacrifice was a seed. You plant it, water it with love, and years later, you harvest gratitude. But as he stared at the empty chair across from him at the kitchen table, he began to wonder, what if the seed had never taken root at all? Holidays were supposed to be the markers of family, the anchor points in the rushing tide of life when everyone came home. For Daniel Whitaker, they became reminders of absence, each one more hollow than the last. The first Thanksgiving without his children was the hardest. He had risen early out of habit, setting the table as Margaret once did. He roasted a small chicken, because what use was a turkey for one man alone, and placed 2 candles in the center, as if expecting company. But as the hours passed, the phone never rang. Mark had gone skiing with friends. Emily and her husband were visiting his in-laws out of state. Daniel sat at the table anyway, folding his hands, whispering a prayer not of thanks but of longing. He carved the chicken, ate a few bites, and wrapped the rest in foil that would sit untouched in the refrigerator. The candles burned low, their light flickering against the empty chairs. Christmas was no different. The tree stood in the corner, smaller now, decorated with ornaments chipped from years past. He hung them carefully, each one a memory: Emily's paper angel from 3rd grade, Mark's wooden train from Cub Scouts, a star Margaret had bought when money was tight but hope was still abundant. When Christmas morning came, Daniel brewed coffee and waited, the quiet wrapping itself around him like a shroud. The only gifts beneath the tree were the ones he had wrapped for others. Never delivered, birthdays passed quietly too. One year he baked himself a small cake, decorated with shaky hands, and lit a single candle. He blew it out alone, whispering a wish he no longer believed in, maybe next year. Meanwhile, the world outside moved forward. On social media, he saw photos of his children at holiday parties, Mark in tailored suits, Emily's children unwrapping mountains of presents beneath a glittering tree. Their smiles were bright. But Daniel noticed something. In none of the pictures was there space for him. The silence of those days was heavier than any shift he had ever worked. For the man who had once sacrificed sleep, comfort, and his very dreams to give his family moments like these, the loneliness cut deep. It wasn't just that they weren't there, it was the growing realization that they didn't even notice he wasn't with them. And still, Daniel excused them. He told himself they were busy, that they had families of their own now, that this was life. But a quiet ache lodged itself deeper in his chest each year, whispering the question he was too afraid to say aloud: had all his sacrifices been forgotten? Holidays, once filled with laughter and chaos, had become mirrors, reflecting back to him the emptiness of a house where love used to live. It began, as most tragedies do, quietly. At first, it was shortness of breath when Daniel climbed the porch steps, a tightness in his chest he blamed on age. Then came the nights of restless coughing, the mornings where his hands trembled as he tried to pour coffee into his chipped mug. He told himself it was nothing. After all, he had worked through pain his entire life. What was one more ache to endure? But the body has limits, even for men who never allowed themselves to believe in them. One afternoon, while mending a broken hinge on the kitchen door, he collapsed. The world spun, his vision darkened, and he woke to the sterile light of a hospital room. The doctor's words landed like stones. Stage 4, advanced. We'll manage the pain, but the sentence trailed off into silence, and Daniel understood. His time was measured now, not in years, but in months, maybe weeks, lying in that bed. Tubes in his arm, the steady beep of machines beside him, Daniel thought of one thing, not himself, not even the illness, but his children. Surely now, he thought, they would come. Surely now they would remember the man who carried them, fed them, gave them every chance at life. With trembling hands, he called Mark first. The phone rang long before his son finally answered, voice clipped and hurried. "Dad, I'm in a meeting. Can this wait?" Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. "It's important. The doctors, they say it's cancer. I don't have much time." There was a pause, the sound of shuffling papers, then a sigh. "Dad, I'm sorry, that's tough, but listen, the company's launching next month. I can't just leave now. I'll try to visit soon." Soon never came. Emily answered next, her voice warm at first. "Dad, how are you?" Daniel told her softly about the diagnosis. There was a sharp inhale on the other end, then silence. He waited, hoping for words of comfort, of promise. Instead, her voice returned, soft but distant. "Oh, Dad, that's awful, but Paul's in surgery rotations, the kids have school, I just can't get away right now. Maybe after the holidays we'll plan a trip." The holidays, he didn't even know if he would see them. Robert, his brother, offered little more than a muttered, "Stay strong, Henry, you always do," before changing the subject. Each call ended the same way, with Daniel staring at the phone in his hand, the silence of the room pressing in. The machine beside him, the only thing that seemed to keep him company. He had thought illness would bring them back, that mortality would strip away excuses, that love would rise above busyness. Instead, what he heard was distance wrapped in politeness, excuses dressed as sympathy. And so Daniel lay in his bed, waiting for footsteps that never came. He whispered into the still air as though speaking to Margaret's memory. "I gave them everything, everything. Why can't they give me this one thing, just to be here?" But the answer never came. Only the cold hum of the hospital lights and the echo of his children's words. "I'm busy, Dad, I can't right now." Hospitals are noisy places, machines humming, carts rattling, voices echoing down white-tiled corridors. But for Daniel Whitaker, the noise only seemed to emphasize the silence that surrounded him. Every day he waited. He kept his eyes fixed on the doorway, listening for footsteps that might be his children's. He imagined their faces appearing, imagined their voices breaking the monotony with laughter or even with tears. But the doorway remained empty. The only ones who entered were nurses checking his vitals and doctors explaining treatment plans in flat, clinical tones. A man can grow accustomed to pain. He can grit his teeth through broken bones, endure the weight of years bent under labor. But loneliness, that is a wound no medicine can heal. Daniel felt it in the small hours of the night, when the ward grew quiet and the shadows stretched long across the floor. He'd turn his head toward the chair beside his bed, imagining Mark sitting there, working late on his laptop just to be near him, or Emily softly humming the way she once did as a child when she colored at the kitchen table. But when his tired eyes adjusted, the chair was always empty. It was then that he began to talk to Margaret, not aloud, not enough for the staff to hear, but in whispers of the heart. "You'd have been here," he told her. "You'd never have left me alone like this. Sometimes." He swore he could feel her presence in the stillness, the same way he once felt her hand steady his when life was heavy. It was during one of those nights that a nurse named Claire noticed. She was younger, her hair tied back, her face lined not with years but with the fatigue of endless shifts. Yet she had a softness about her, the kind that sees more than charts and monitors. She paused one evening when she came in to adjust his Roman 4. Watching the way his eyes lingered on the doorway. "Are you waiting for someone, Mr. Whitaker?" she asked gently. Daniel managed a faint smile. Always, he whispered. She hesitated, sensing the weight behind that single word. She didn't press him, but she stayed a moment longer than she needed to. She straightened the blanket, adjusted the pillow, and gave him the smallest gift she could, her presence. Over the next few days, Claire noticed the pattern. Other patients had visitors, flowers on their tables, balloons tied to chairs, laughter that spilled out into the hall. But Daniel's room remained bare, quiet, forgotten. His children sent no cards. No calls came through the front desk for him. Only the steady beep of the monitor marked his life. And yet when Claire asked him about his family, his eyes still softened. "They're busy," he said, always defending them. "They have their lives to live." She wanted to believe him, but the look in his eyes told another story, the story of a man who had given everything only to sit alone in the hour when he needed them most. That night, as she walked away from his room, Claire felt something stir inside her. She had seen patients alone before, but there was something about Daniel's silence, about the quiet dignity with which he carried abandonment, that unsettled her. She began to realize this was not just the story of an illness. This was the story of a father's love, forgotten by the very people it had built. Night in a hospital moves differently. Time slows, stretched thin by the steady rhythm of machines, until minutes feel like hours. For Daniel Whitaker, those hours became a canvas, when his mind filled with the colors of memory. He saw himself younger again, shoulders broad, hands unbroken by arthritis. He remembered the construction site, the sting of rain against his face, the burn of the summer sun. He remembered coming home with boots caked in mud. Margaret waiting at the door with a tired smile and a warm meal. He could almost hear her voice again, soft and certain. "Danny, you work too hard." He remembered the little house he bought with scraped-together paychecks. How proud he had been the day he carried Margaret across the threshold, her laughter filling the empty rooms like music. He remembered patching the roof in the dead of winter so the children could sleep warm, even while icy water dripped down his neck. Then came the milestones, the ones that had made every ache worth it. Mark's first bicycle, wobbly down the street with Daniel's steady hand on the seat. Emily's school recital, her voice trembling but bright, while Daniel clapped the loudest from the back row. He remembered birthdays with candles glowing, Christmas mornings with paper scattered like confetti across the living room. All those moments painted with his sacrifice, framed by his labor. But as the memories played, the contrast cut deep. The chair beside his hospital bed was empty. The phone on the nightstand silent. His children, the very ones he had bent his life around, were nowhere to be found. He thought of Mark's voice on the phone. "I can't leave work now, Dad." He thought of Emily's careful excuses. "Maybe after the holidays we'll visit." He thought of how easily they spoke, as if his final days were simply another item on their crowded calendars. Daniel turned his head toward the window where the city lights flickered in the distance. He whispered into the glass, as if speaking to the boy he once was. "I gave them everything. Why does it feel like I'm the one forgotten?" Tears welled in his tired eyes, but he blinked them back, not out of pride, but out of habit. He had always been the strong one, the quiet one, the one who bore the weight so others didn't have to. Even now, even here, he carried the loneliness alone. And yet, deep inside, he still hoped. Hoped that one morning he would open his eyes and see Mark in the chair, laptop closed for once. Hoped that Emily would walk in with her children, her arms open, her eyes brimming with the same gratitude he had once dreamed of. Hope, after all, was the one thing he had never been able to give up. When words no longer found their way into conversation, Daniel turned to paper. A nurse had left a small journal on his bedside table, thinking he might jot down questions for the doctors or perhaps notes to help with medication. Instead, Daniel picked up a pen and began to write, not to the doctors, not even to himself, but to the children who weren't there. His handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven, but the words carried the weight of a lifetime. He did not scold, he did not blame. That was never Daniel's way. Instead, he wrote the way he had lived, with quiet devotion, with love disguised as sacrifice. "My dear Mark and Emily," the first page began. "By the time you read this, I may no longer be here. Don't let that frighten you. Life has a way of carrying us forward, even when the people we love can't walk beside us anymore." He paused, his eyes wet, then continued. "I want you to know something I never said enough. You were my dream. I once wanted to be a painter, to leave behind colors on a canvas. Instead, I left behind you, and you were the greatest work I could ever create. Night after night, when the ward was quiet, Daniel filled those pages. He wrote about the mornings when Mark learned to ride a bike, about Emily's first day of school when she clung to his hand. He wrote about Christmases when money was tight but laughter was rich. About Sunday dinners when Margaret's cooking turned their small home into the warmest place on earth. If you remember nothing else, he wrote, remember that you were loved. Every hour I worked, every dollar I saved, every dream I put aside, it was all for you, not because I had to, but because I wanted to, because that's what love is, giving without expecting to be paid back. Sometimes his tears smudged the ink. Sometimes his hand grew too weak to hold the pen. And he had to rest before continuing. But always he returned to the journal, as if the act of writing was the only way to keep his family close, even if only on paper. On the last page he wrote the words that cost him the most, but also freed him the most. I forgive you, for the calls not made, for the visits not taken, for the empty chair at my bedside. I forgive you because love is larger than disappointment, stronger than absence. And if someday you hold this letter, know this, your father's heart was never empty. It was full of you until the very end. When he finished, he closed the journal softly and slipped it into the drawer beside his bed. He never told the nurses about it. He never mailed it to his children. It was not meant to demand their attention. It was meant to hold his truth. The letter remained there unsent, waiting, not for him but for them. And it would be this letter, the one he never spoke of, that would later change everything. By the time Claire began her night shifts on Daniel Whitaker's floor, his body had already grown frail. His once strong hands, the same hands that had carried beams and bricks through storms, now trembled when he reached for a glass of water. His voice, once deep and steady, came in whispers, but his eyes, they still carried stories, even if no one else bothered to look long enough to see them. Claire noticed what others didn't. She noticed how his gaze lingered on the empty chair beside his bed. She noticed the way he pretended to sleep when visiting hours came and went with no footsteps from family. She noticed that when she adjusted his blanket, he would murmur, "Thank you," as if gratitude was his second language. One evening, as she was tidying the small drawer at his bedside, her fingers brushed against a worn leather notebook. It was tucked neatly under his folded glasses case, its edges frayed. Its cover softened by use. Claire hesitated. Nurses are not meant to pry, but something about the way Daniel's eyes flickered toward it told her this was no ordinary notebook. "Is this yours, Mr. Whitaker?" she asked gently. Daniel gave a faint smile, one that seemed both proud and shy. "Just thoughts," he whispered, "nothing important." But when Daniel drifted into sleep that night, his breathing shallow and uneven, Claire could not resist opening the journal. She promised herself only to peek, to make sure it wasn't something medical she should note, but as her eyes fell on the first lines, she realized she had stepped into something sacred. "My dear Mark and Emily, by the time you read this, I may no longer be here." Claire's throat tightened. Page after page, she read the words of a father who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. He did not accuse, he did not scold, he simply poured out love, raw, unwavering, unconditional. He wrote about fishing trips never taken, birthdays celebrated with worn hands, sacrifices invisible to anyone but him. He wrote of forgiveness, gentle, undeserved, but freely given. And beneath every line, between every word, Claire could see it, his loneliness. The long nights when he wrote not because anyone would ever read, but because writing was the only way to keep himself from disappearing altogether. She closed the notebook carefully, almost reverently, and slipped it back where she found it. But that night, when she returned to her station, her eyes burned with tears she couldn't explain. She had tended to patients before, fed them, washed them, comforted them, but this was different. With Daniel, she wasn't just caring for a man, she was carrying his story. From that moment on, she became more than his nurse, she became his witness. She stayed longer at his bedside when her rounds were done, listening when he spoke about Margaret's laughter, or Mark's first bike ride, or Emily's childhood drawings taped to the fridge. She nodded when he whispered regrets, but always reminded him softly, "They don't erase what you gave, Mr. Whitaker." Daniel began to look for her in the evenings, and though Claire never said it aloud, she began to look for him too, not as another patient, but as a reminder of what love looks like when it is poured out completely, even when no one seems to notice. What Claire didn't yet know was this: soon that little notebook would travel beyond the hospital walls, and Daniel's quiet words, meant only for his children, would one day touch countless hearts he never met. It was late, nearly midnight, when Daniel finally let the words slip. The ward was quiet, the fluorescent lights dimmed, the world outside swallowed by darkness. Claire sat beside him, chart in hand, though she had finished her rounds long ago. She stayed not because she had to, but because she had learned that silence was heavier for him than pain. "Claire," Daniel whispered, his voice like wind through dry leaves, "can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" She set the chart aside and leaned closer. Of course. And then slowly, piece by piece, the dam broke. He told her about his dream of painting, the canvases he once imagined, the colors he once longed to leave behind. He spoke of the sketchbook he had thrown away the day Margaret told him she was expecting, how he told himself family was more important than art. "I thought giving it up was noble," he said, his eyes wet, "but some nights I wondered if I erased myself too." He confessed the exhaustion of endless work, how every callus on his hands was a love letter his children never read. He spoke of the loneliness that grew louder as they succeeded, the bitter irony of watching them reach heights he had built ladders for while he was left behind at the bottom. He admitted regrets, not taking Margaret to the ocean she had always dreamed of seeing. Not saying "I love you" to his children as often as he should have, thinking his labor spoke loud enough. "But work doesn't hug you back," he said softly. Claire listened, her heart tightening with every word. She had cared for many patients, heard countless stories whispered in the shadow of death, but Daniel's was different. It wasn't just illness that was ending his life. It was neglect, abandonment, the slow erosion of a man who gave everything and received silence in return. When his breath grew uneven, she reached for his hand. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "your life mattered, it still matters, don't ever believe otherwise." Daniel gave her a faint smile. "Promise me," he whispered, "promise me someone will remember that I wasn't just a man who worked himself into the ground." Claire swallowed hard. She had no family photo to show, no children to call, but she had her phone, quietly without telling him. She pressed record and set it on the bedside table. His voice, fragile but full of truth, filled the tiny microphone. A father's story, a man's confession, a heart laid bare. That night when she returned to the nurse's station, she listened again. His words crackled softly through the speaker, each sentence both heartbreaking and beautiful, and she knew this wasn't meant to stay hidden. This was meant to be heard. Claire began to write down his story in her notes, each detail carefully preserved. Later she would type them into her phone, shaping his life into chapters the way he had written for his children. She didn't know yet how far it would go. But she knew one thing: Daniel Whitaker's voice would not vanish into sterile hospital walls. And in the quiet of that night, as Daniel drifted into uneasy sleep, Claire whispered a vow he never fully heard. "I'll remember for you. I'll carry your story. I promise." Claire hesitated for days. The recordings of Daniel's trembling voice lived inside her phone like a fragile bird she was afraid to release. They weren't hers to share, not really. Yet every time she replayed them, she felt the same ache in her chest, that this story, this man, could not be allowed to vanish into silence. It was a Saturday night when she finally opened a blank post. She typed carefully, "I'm a nurse. I've been caring for an elderly man who gave up his entire life, his dreams, his health, his joy for his family. Now he lies in a hospital bed, forgotten by the very people he carried. Tonight he told me things he's never told anyone. With his permission, I want the world to hear him." Her finger hovered over post for a long time, then with a deep breath she pressed it. The video began simply, a shaky recording of Daniel's voice, soft but steady. "I once dreamed of being a painter, but I laid that dream down to build a life for my family. Every brick I carried, every hour I worked, it was all for them. And now in these final days, the chair beside my bed is empty, but still I love them, still I forgive them." The response was immediate. Within hours, hundreds of comments poured in. By morning, there were thousands. Strangers from around the world wrote words Daniel's own children hadn't. "Sir, I don't know you, but you are not forgotten. Your sacrifices matter. You lived love the way it was meant to be lived. I wish I could sit by your bed and hold your hand. You remind me of my own father." The post spread across platforms, shared, reshared, stitched, quoted. News outlets began to pick it up. "The Lonely Father's Diary. A nurse shares a dying man's words that broke the internet." In the hospital, Claire held her phone to Daniel's ear and let him hear. At first he didn't understand. His brows furrowed, his lips parted in disbelief. Then the tears came, tears not of sorrow, but of something he had thought he'd lost forever: recognition. People, they heard me, he whispered. They did, Claire replied, squeezing his frail hand, and they're listening. Daniel closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, a true smile touched his lips. It wasn't the smile of a man forgotten. It was the smile of a man finally seen. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his story had only just begun to ripple outward. That soon the entire world would be speaking his name, even as his own children stayed silent. And in the corner of that hospital room, Claire wiped her eyes and whispered the vow again, "I'll remember for you. I'll make sure they all do." Within days, the video spread far beyond what Claire ever imagined. It appeared on news feeds in small towns and big cities, whispered over dinner tables, reposted by celebrities who added captions like, "Don't let this be your father, call him today." Letters began arriving at the hospital. At first, just a few handwritten notes on simple stationery, but soon they came in bundles tied together with string. Their envelopes marked from places Daniel had never seen, Montana, California, even as far as Ireland and Australia. "Dear Mr. Whitaker," one read, "I lost my father before I ever got to thank him. Please know that I see you and I thank you for reminding me what love looks like." Another said, "I don't have much family, but if I did, I'd hope they were like you. You're not alone anymore." Flowers crowded his room, sunflowers, roses. Daisies sent from strangers who wanted his last days to be brighter than the years of sacrifice that had gone unseen. Nurses had to bring in an extra table just to hold them all, but the most remarkable thing were the visitors. One afternoon, Claire wheeled Daniel into the hospital garden for fresh air. As they reached the courtyard, a small group was waiting, strangers holding candles, quietly singing hymns and songs about love and family. They had driven for hours just to sit near him, to show him that his story had not fallen into emptiness. Daniel's frail hands trembled as he waved to them. His voice cracked when he whispered, "They came for me." Claire nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes, Daniel, for you." Every day more came. Retired fathers who saw themselves in his sacrifice. Sons and daughters who carried guilt over neglecting their parents. Young people who promised they would never let their own families drift apart. They came with stories, with apologies, with gratitude, and through it all, the chair beside Daniel's bed, the one he had longed for his children to fill, remained empty. Mark sent a brief text, "Saw something about you online, can't talk now, work's insane." Emily left a voicemail, her voice brisk, "Dad, this has gotten out of hand. Maybe you should tell that nurse to stop. It's embarrassing." Embarrassing, that was the word she used. Daniel read the messages, his eyes clouding with both sorrow and clarity. And then, gently, he set the phone aside and turned back to the stack of letters waiting for him. Letters from people who had never met him, but who seemed to understand him better than his own blood. The world had heard his story, and in their response, Daniel found something he had not felt in a very long time: dignity. Claire watched all of this unfold, her heart heavy but also hopeful. She realized she was no longer just his nurse. She had become the bridge between Daniel and the world, and she promised herself that as long as she was there, he would never again feel unseen. For Daniel Whitaker, the man who once believed his sacrifices would vanish unnoticed, the world had answered back, "We see you, we remember you, you are not forgotten." Tide that had lifted Daniel's story into the hearts of strangers soon turned its gaze toward the people who were missing from the picture, his family. Online threads filled with outrage. "Where are his kids?" strangers demanded. "How can they leave him alone while strangers send flowers?" Comment sections burned with condemnation. "If this were my father, I'd be at his side every hour." "They took his sacrifice but can't give him their time. Money isn't love, time is." Journalists began to ask the same questions. Reporters called the hospital, asking whether his son or daughter had visited. Local news segments replayed Daniel's words over soft piano music, then cut to interviews with community members shaking their heads in disbelief. By the second week, the pressure was undeniable. Mark received emails from clients, even employees, asking if the man in the videos was truly his father. Emily's neighbors whispered in the grocery aisles, their glances heavy with judgment. Social media filled with their names, their photos unearthed, tied publicly to the story of a forgotten father. Finally, they appeared. One gray afternoon, Daniel opened his eyes to find Mark and Emily standing awkwardly in the doorway of his hospital room. Their expensive clothes seemed out of place against the sterile walls. Mark clutched his phone as if it were a lifeline. Emily held her purse tightly. Her lips pressed into a line. "Dad," Mark said first, his voice too brisk, too polished, like a man closing a deal rather than greeting his dying father. "We thought we should come." Daniel blinked, his heart lifting for a brief moment, then sinking again as he caught the distance in their eyes. Emily leaned forward, brushing his hand lightly. "You've gone viral, Dad," she said, her smile strained. "Everyone's talking about you. Not we missed you, not we're sorry." Only the acknowledgement of the storm outside these walls. Claire, who stood quietly in the corner, saw it for what it was, not love but performance, not presence but damage control. She watched as Mark posted a photo on social media, angled carefully to capture his father in the bed with the caption, "Spending time with Dad tonight, family first," words that had never sounded so hollow. Daniel, though frail, understood. He felt it in the shallow conversations, in the way their eyes darted toward their phones more than toward him. They asked about his comfort, his meals, his treatment, but never about his memories, never about his heart. Their questions were scripted, their presence forced, and yet Daniel didn't lash out. He didn't demand apologies. Instead, he smiled weakly, whispered, "I'm glad you're here," though his chest ached with the truth. They weren't there for him. They were there for themselves, for appearances, for reputation, for the weight of a community's judgment. That night when they left, the room felt colder than before. Daniel turned his head toward Claire and whispered, "They came, but it wasn't really them, was it?" Claire's eyes glistened. She wanted to tell him that love would still find its way, that maybe their visit meant a change of heart. But she couldn't lie to him, not to the man who had already borne a lifetime of lies wrapped in politeness. Instead, she squeezed his hand and said softly, "The world sees you, Daniel, even if they don't." And for the first time, Daniel understood something he had tried so long to deny. Sometimes, family isn't defined by blood. Sometimes, it's defined by who chooses to show up when the world grows quiet. The days grew shorter for Daniel, though the clock on the wall ticked at its usual pace. His body weakened with each sunrise. The simple act of lifting a spoon became exhausting, his voice softer with every word. The doctors spoke less now of treatment and more of comfort, their tone careful, almost apologetic. Claire stayed close. Every evening she pulled a chair to his bedside, reading aloud the letters that kept arriving. Strangers wrote from across the world. "You remind me of my dad. I lost him too soon. Because of you, I called my father tonight for the first time in years. You may feel alone, but millions of us are sitting by your bed in spirit." Daniel listened with closed eyes, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It's funny," he whispered one night. "The whole world sits with me, and yet the ones I raised can't find the time." Mark and Emily had come once more, both tense and impatient. Mark stayed only long enough to take another carefully framed photo, a gesture Claire could hardly stomach. Emily promised to visit again the following week, but her voice lacked conviction. Neither returned, and Robert, his brother, never came at all, but others did. Nurses from different wards stopped by on their breaks to hold his hand. A group of local churchgoers brought a guitar and sang softly outside his room. A retired steelworker who had read about him in the news drove 2 hours just to sit by Daniel's bed and talk about the dignity of labor, and Claire, faithful, gentle Claire, became his constant. She brushed his thinning hair back from his forehead, adjusted the flowers when they wilted, whispered to him when pain pulled him into silence. Sometimes she would even hum a tune, an old lullaby her grandmother had sung to her, as if to remind him that someone was still willing to cradle him in his final days. Daniel began to call her my witness. "You'll remember me, won't you?" he asked one evening, his hand weak in hers. "I will," she said, her voice steady though her eyes blurred with tears. "And so will the world." In those last days, Daniel no longer looked to the door, waiting for children who never came. Instead, he looked to the notebook Claire kept near his bed, filled now with his words, his memories, his truth. He looked to the strangers who sent love from afar, to the nurse who refused to let him vanish into silence. And slowly he began to accept that sometimes, family is not the ones you raise, but the ones who choose to stand beside you when the night grows longest. As the machines hummed and the hours slipped by, Daniel Whitaker, once a man buried by sacrifice, began to feel something he had almost forgotten. Not wealth, not recognition, but love, pure and unconditional, from people who owed him nothing and yet gave him everything. And in that he found peace. The end came quietly, the way twilight slips into night, not with thunder, but with a hush. Daniel Whitaker's breaths had grown shallow for days, each one a little more fragile, a little less certain. The doctors had already said what Claire dreaded to hear. It's only a matter of time. But time, oh, time feels different when you're counting the last moments of a man who has carried the weight of others his whole life. That evening, Claire sat close, her hand wrapped gently around his. The flowers in his room had begun to fade, but fresh bouquets had already been ordered by strangers who never wanted his bedside to be empty. A candlelight vigil was being live-streamed outside the hospital, hundreds of people standing in the cool night air holding candles, whispering prayers. Thousands more watched online, their screens glowing in living rooms and bedrooms across the country. And yet the chairs reserved for his children remained empty. No Mark, no Emily. No Robert. It was not anger Daniel carried in those final hours, it was acceptance. His eyes, though tired, softened whenever Claire leaned close. "You stayed," he whispered. "That's all a man can ask, for someone to stay." Claire's voice trembled as she answered, "You're not alone, Daniel. Look." She held up her phone, showing him the live stream, faces of strangers, comments flooding in. "We're with you. Rest easy, Dad. The world is your family now." A tear slipped from the corner of his eye. For a moment it wasn't machines or medicine that kept him alive. It was the truth that he was finally, undeniably seen. As his breathing slowed, Claire leaned closer, her forehead resting gently against his temple. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice steady despite the breaking in her chest. "You've done enough. You can rest now." His lips parted, forming one last whisper, "Tell them I loved them." And with that, Daniel Whitaker exhaled for the final time. The monitor gave its long, unbroken tone. But outside the hospital, candles continued to glow, voices continued to sing softly into the night. Across the world, people bowed their heads, typing words of farewell to a man they had never met but somehow felt they knew. Claire closed his eyes with trembling fingers, kissed his forehead gently, and whispered, "I'll tell them, Daniel, and I'll make sure the world never forgets." In that moment, a quiet hospital room became something more, a sanctuary. A place where a man who had given everything and received so little from those he loved was carried into eternity, not in silence, but in the arms of a family he had found in strangers. Daniel Whitaker did not die alone. He died embraced by a community larger than blood, a community born of truth, sacrifice, and love. And though his children never came, the world did. News of Daniel Whitaker's passing did not fade with the week's headlines. If anything, it spread wider. The video Claire posted of his final words reached millions within days. The notebook he had written, pages inked with love, regret, and forgiveness, was scanned and shared online, translated into different languages, quoted on posters, printed in newspapers. Teachers read passages aloud to their students. "Every hour I worked, every dream I set aside, it was all for you." Pastors wove his words into sermons, reminding congregations that love is measured not in possessions, but in presence. Families sat down together, phones set aside, and whispered the question no one had dared ask before: are we giving enough to each other while we still can? Daniel Whitaker had become something more than a forgotten father. He had become a mirror, forcing the world to look at itself. Claire, carrying the responsibility of his final request, stepped forward publicly. Standing outside the hospital with cameras trained on her, she spoke softly but firmly. "He didn't ask me to shame his children. He didn't ask me to point fingers. All he asked was this: tell them I loved them, and I will. But I will also tell the world that love, if left unseen, withers in silence. No one deserves the end he faced, and yet he still forgave. That is his legacy." The crowd was silent, many weeping. As Claire reached into her pocket and lifted the small leather journal for all to see, "This," she said, "isn't just Daniel's story, it's a gift, a reminder that even ordinary lives can echo louder than we imagine." And then came the revelation, the twist no one expected. Through the help of his lawyer, it was discovered that Daniel had quietly saved over the years. Not millions, not a fortune, but enough to matter, enough to make a choice. And in his final will, he had left it not to Mark, not to Emily, not to Robert. Instead, he established the Margaret Whitaker Scholarship Fund, named after the wife who had stood by him through every storm. A fund dedicated to helping children from working-class families pursue the very dreams he had laid aside. The announcement shook the community. News anchors choked up as they told the story. "A father who sacrificed everything for his family," they said. has left a legacy not for those who abandoned him, but for those who still have a chance to dream. Letters poured in again, not just of sympathy, but of action. Donations doubled the scholarship size. Universities reached out to partner. A single man's story had sparked a movement larger than his life, and somewhere in the quiet of the hospital chapel, Claire lit a candle for Daniel and whispered through tears, "You're free now, and look, your love didn't die with you, it's still here, it's everywhere." For Daniel Whitaker, the man who had once feared he would leave this world unseen, the truth was clear: he had never been invisible. His life had become a lantern, one that would guide countless others long after his heart had stopped. He was gone, yes, but his legacy, his love, was immortal. In the end, Daniel Whitaker's story was not about his death. It was about his love, quiet, steadfast, unseen by those he gave it to most, but finally recognized by a world that understood too late. He left this life in a hospital bed, his children absent, his body frail. To some, that may sound like loneliness, but if you look closely, you'll see something else. You'll see a man whose words outlived him, whose sacrifices ignited change, whose love became a river that flowed far beyond his family's doorstep. His children may have missed their chance to sit beside him, but strangers across the world, teachers, fathers, daughters, nurses, sat with him in spirit. They carried his story like a torch, passing it from hand to hand, promising never to forget. And perhaps that is what love truly is, not measured in who claims your blood, but in who carries your memory when you're gone. Daniel's legacy lives on in the scholarship that bears his wife's name, in the words of his journal, and in the millions of hearts that read his story and whispered a quiet vow to themselves. "I will not wait until it is too late. I will love now. I will show up now." So let his life be a reminder for me, for you, for all of us, that parents are not permanent. They are living, breathing gifts. They will not always be here to answer the phone, to sit at the dinner table, to tell the same old stories you've heard 100 times. One day the chair will be empty. One day the call will go unanswered. Don't let that day come before you've said what matters most. Don't let your love go unspoken, because Daniel's final whisper still echoes tonight. Tell them I loved them. And now I will echo it to you. Love them while you can. See them while they're still here. Hold them as if tomorrow is not promised, because it never is. If Daniel's story moved you, let it move you to action. Call your parents, hug them, tell them you love them, and then share this story so others can remember too. Leave a comment below. Tell us, what memory of your parents do you cherish most? Subscribe to Twisted Roots so you'll never miss the stories that remind us of what truly matters. And most of all, carry this lesson with you long after the video ends, because in the end, the greatest legacy any of us can leave is love.